Well, ladies and gentlemen, one of the great joys that I've had with these online intellectual groups and within the arts and in thinking, philosophy, and so on is meeting tremendous individuals. And someone who I've really loved getting to know and learn from, his channel, his material is just, it's deep, it's magnificent, but it's also presented in a very engaging way, is the one and only Davood Gozli. And Davood and I have had a chance to read some books together on Benjamin Fontaine, who I would have never known about without Davood, and now who I adore, Isaiah Berlin, Hayden White, and his reviews are just magnificent. Like I've randomly had days where I'm like, let me just go through Davood's channel and see what he's done. I was like, oh, he's done ones on Augustine. Oh, he did this series on Plato's, and you could just always go and learn. His recent series on qualitative research, user experience is fascinating. I find that topic just wonderful, and he always carries himself in interviews and conversations in such a just fantastic way that I just would hope to model and that I appreciate. So Davood Gozli, thank you for being here today. It's really a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much, Daniel. It's great to be here. Great to see you and talk with you. I was looking forward to this conversation for a week, and yeah, great to be here.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Davood, I appreciate it. Well, we were talking back and forth about subjects to go into, and Davood brought up a subject that I just found really, really interesting, that I think is actually very important. It's one of those topics that when you hear and you go, oh, that is interesting. Well, how does that work exactly? But until someone asks the question, you never think to look at it straight on or clearly. And I just thought it was really, really great what you brought up, Davood. And I just thought I would ask you a chance to bring up that subject and to talk about it for a moment.
Sure. So to give the kind of a funny context, I think you wanted to initially talk about a recent book that is coming out. I co-edited it with Professor Jan Valziner, who's a very influential cultural psychologist. So we edited this book called Experimental Psychology, Ambitions and Possibility, which I do not recommend people buy for the following reason. Because I think that the publisher Springer usually brings out books that are overpriced, and they are not intended for individual purchase. I think they're intended for the purpose of institutional purchase. Institutions make the books available online through university libraries and so on and so forth. And the other reason is that the books tend to be Springer books, as to the degree that I can tell, they tend to be technical, and you have to be part of like a little community of researchers to care about the subject matter. So I kind of responded half jokingly that, yeah, it might not be super important, significant to talk about that book. And in general, I started talking about the idea of interest. So in 2009, I wrote a book about, the book came out, I was writing it in the prior 2 years. It came out that it kind of expressed my thoughts and my critique, my discomfort with an uncontrolled use of experimental psychology in human sciences. And once that book was done, once it came out, I realized that things had changed. I couldn't really continue reading the papers that I was reading and criticize. I just kind of I had run out of fuel. And I just realized that I had reoriented myself. So my taste or my interest had changed. So this is the topic. The topic is the loss of interest, the sudden loss of interest. And you're not talking about a lack of interest or the inability to be interested in something because you don't have the necessary skills or background, or you haven't acquired the taste for it, like philosophy, like even coffee or wine tasting, whatever the case, whatever the example, the field. It is a loss of interest that is more like disillusionment, becoming disillusioned in something. Like the thing, the field, the activity is not what you originally thought it would be. It is something else. It is something that doesn't deliver those original promises. And at the same time, you are perceiving so many other people in the field still talking about those promises. And you go around, it's like, is it just me who 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 realizes that the fruits of our labors are just far more modest than we thought in the beginning. The fruits, in my case, experimental psychology, they're very modest. There are certain things that we can demonstrate using the methods, but overall, it's not a huge contribution to humanity. I mean, there are better things to do with one's time. It's okay if you're interested in it, if you're obsessed with it, but I'm not. I was in for a few years, but I kind of lost that interest. But that was my reason to say, let's talk about something other than these books. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed that story. So, a few things come to mind. So I started a photography business when I was about 15. My aunt gave me a camera for Christmas because I take very long walks in the mountain. And she was like, you ought to take pictures of where you go to. So you took these pictures and did that, and did business, did galleries, consignments, weddings, and different things. But really around, I want to say maybe when I was 23, I was just like, not really an extreme interest to keep taking photographs, right? And you'd have lots of people be, oh, you used to do that. Why don't you do it anymore? Almost as if it was a loss, like it was something to regret. But for me, it wasn't something to regret. It was like, oh, it had a phase. I learned to look at that. It's interesting too, because part of this, it's almost like I felt like I got what I needed out of it. Not that I went into photography looking for anything. I think if you go into something looking for stuff, you don't really go into it all in. And so it's just a means to an end. But you learn to look at things. I enjoyed being outdoors. I took pictures, and it affected my writing. It affected my thinking in positive ways. And I felt like everything I got out of photography was sublated into what I was doing now. But that photography itself didn't have that role. Also, in order to get, it was very clear to me that to get to the level where the technology was advancing, I started with film. People weren't too interested in film, costs, what it would require to be like a full-time wedding photographer who could be charging $3,000 was a very, very big hurdle to go there. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't really want to do that. Mm-hmm. And I've never regretted it. I've not regretted it. But it's very interesting when you think of the questions like, why did you shift? What was that experience that made you go, oh, this isn't for me anymore? Mm-hmm. And so I relate to your story that way. And the other thing I wanted to say is I really like how you have framed this not as a question of losing interest or disinterest or gaining interest, because there's a lot of talk about this. This is that interesting question of, it's like the train comes to the track and the switches change and it goes to the right instead of the left. Why did it go one way versus the other? What happens in a person's life that makes interest change? I'm always very interested in these switch moments. So for example, I'm always interested in language on the question when someone comes up to you and asks you, do you want to go to the movies, when you don't want to go to the movies? Not when you do want to go to the movies, because then you don't really notice. You're like, yeah, let's go. But it's wild to examine the experience of what it's like when someone asks you to do something you don't want to do. Because for me, I try to ground a lot of my thinking about freedom and determinism within that context, because you feel like you lost something. It feels like you had freedom and now you no longer do. But precisely the feeling of thinking you had freedom comes from it's not there anymore, right? Mm. And so what's so interesting too here is precisely evidence of having motivation in interest emerges in the place of it being neutered, of it running against a wall and not feeling it anymore. So it's not a lack of interest. It's almost, for me, it's kind of funny because this experience is almost confirmation of a very powerful motivation or a very active interest that's looking for the thing that it seeks, because at the thing now it's not there anymore. So I appreciate, and I'll give it back to you, I appreciate the framing that you're putting forth.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You're if I heard you correctly, you're referring to this the desire to be driven by interest, and because we have that desire, we are following that desire. We become really conscious and we care about, and maybe we're upset when it's absent.
Yes.
And not everybody might be that way. Not everybody might care as much. Some people just wake up in the morning, have their coffee and go to work, get to work. That attitude is something that I admire. Sometimes I wish I was more like that, but we have our own ways of being in the world. Some of us are more kind of we want that sensation. We want to be guided by that sensation. That almost subliminal, like feeling of being, I'm not sure why, but I feel like I'm on the right track. You know, I feel like this is right. Like going to the movie also was a really good example, because why do we say, no, I don't want to go to the movies right now? Because going to the movies at that state, in that place that we are, feels like a disharmony. It would feel like a disharmonious act. Exactly. It would feel like it wouldn't fit whatever else that is going on. I'm not sure what else is actually going. I cannot name all the things that are true about this state of affairs, but I can tell that this going to the movies act is not going to fit. And that is one thing that I know now about my state. I know that it is a state which doesn't fit going to the movies. Now let's find out a few things more. You know, let's examine what would fit it and what doesn't fit it. And actually, to tell you the truth, the reason why I'd like to do more interviews, which is not really a natural thing for me. I'm more, you know, if you're familiar with my YouTube, for those who are somewhat familiar, it's mostly solitary. I enjoy the solitary mode of just turning on the camera and just talking. And but interviews are really helpful to help you figure out what kinds of conversations you'd like to have, what kind of conversations would feel right. It's like, I don't know why, but this conversation really left me thinking. This conversation really felt like I felt strong in it, or not strong in the sense of like muscle strong, but I felt like my being fully came to the surface. Something like magic started to happen, and you know, the language fails to describe that experience. But you know what I mean. So interviewing helps with that. You kind of you start to explore your own conversational chemistry. What can you do with it with different conversation partners? And you and I, incidentally, always had great conversational chemistry, which I really enjoy.
I enjoy it very much.
Which is why we should do more.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, you know, you said so much that it was perfect. It was really, really well put. So a few things. I do a lot of solitary stuff as well, and the fact that you do such good interviews, and that's a secondary thing, is just a testament to your to the value that you add to people. So well done to you, sir. I really like you know, what you were saying about this harmony with the movie theater, right? So you've got like a few options. So you've got the person who has nothing going on, and they're bored, and someone says, let's go to the movies. And, you know, for that person, going is just going. It's not destabilizing anything because there was no harmony that they could throw off. Then you've got another person that maybe says, no, I don't want to go to the movies, because literally, like, they're just not able to will anything. It's not that they have something going on, is that they're literally just a form of nothingness, right? Kind of an empty being, and maybe they're just afraid of people or something, right? And you see, generally, it's almost like those are the only two categories in our thought. Like if you know, it's either you say yes because, you know, it's your free time and you're off of work and you ought to go, right? Because you don't have anything going on. You ought to have fun because you deserve it. You had a hard week at work and you ought to go enjoy a movie. Or if you say no, it's because you're antisocial, right? It's like and you actually should be encouraged to go because you need to be around people or whatever. But you see, what's so interesting about the topic we're getting at and what you brought up with harmony is almost this third category, where the reason you're saying no is because it doesn't fit into the framework of your interest. It doesn't fit into your time. You have limited time. You know, when you're really interested in there's a lot of things you want to do, is that time matters. And also too, you found that like, if you go to the movies, that can actually set an expectation where they expect you to go to the movies, and then they'll lash you into other things. You don't want to send the wrong signal. So there's a much more complicated social dynamic that can be at play. But what's really funny is if you're not a, dare I say, interested person, you actually usually don't even have to think about all those social dynamics because because you don't need to worry about them because there's no harmony it may destabilize. And so it's very interesting. The more that you're concerned about interest, the more it actually engages into more complicated levels of social interactions, which precisely can be a reason why the overall socioeconomic system may train us to have very simple interests. Like you're interested in going to work, you're interested in that from 9 to 5. Once that is over, you don't do it. And your interests are kind of contained within these very linear bubbles in boxes, because if they're not contained, there suddenly becomes an entire kind of harmony of your life, of what you do and how you use your time, that brings much more complicated dynamics of interaction and how you think about what you do and what you don't want to do. And if you're in that game, then that can result in some social alienation. That can result in some people coming after you because they only have those structures to think in terms of. And I do think capitalism in general tends to like interest reserved for work because they want you consuming when you're not at work. And if you're, say, interested in reading, you're not really spending that much money. Maybe you drop 20 bucks on the book, maybe, but like a conversation doesn't make a lot of money. You know, that's not going to generate a profit for anyone, right? So you can actually, I think, have a macro system to think of interest purely in terms of your work. You know, your interest is contained in what you do, or you have free time. And what's very problematic with that, and then I'll give it back to you, is basically that only creates two categories then for being interested at work. You know, you're either lazy or you're productive. Like if you go to a job and you're no longer interested in it, it's like, oh, well, you should just work harder and be more focused. And that's just a sign of being lazy. We don't even have the category in our mind of a interest that is so thriving that wants to move on. Like it's a purporting powerful interest that it's not being served in that condition. It's not a sign of laziness. It's actually a sign that the current environment is not providing the, say, in a sense, spiritually productive or willfully productive resources that the person is looking for. And that's the sort of category that I think we need to add to our thinking that this problem can kind of unveil. That one of the things I have hope for is it seems like the internet provides ways for that will that's always looking for something to plug in or to do its own creative work, which can bring with it a certain exhaustion because one has to balance that while also doing the econ work or also doing the blue collar work or different things. For me, that's why, like you mentioned, the ability to go to work and kind of shut off your brain. One of the reasons I've kind of always liked making money blue collar wise is precisely because it's much easier to do that if you're just putting poles in the ground or you're unloading, unfolding chairs. Whereas anytime I tried to make money or have considered work that would, say, also be intellectual, it's this problem that you're describing comes up. Like I was terrible. Like the night before tests in school, I would be so inspired to write a chapter in the Sword of Tribulation. It was impossible for me to think about the Latin test. I just could not care less. And I would be up till like 4 a.m. working on the chapter because that was always when the perfect ideas came, was right in that environment. And I just could not care less about the other thing. Not because I didn't care about Latin or care about English literature or whatever. It's because there were times where a greater interest would come out that would be more important. And it was not fitting when you have the inspiration to finally figure out how to get, how to write that chapter or how to write that essay you're interested on that topic on Heidegger, it almost feels like a dishonoring to that inspiration, not to take it. It's almost like heresy. It's almost like a religious sin or something to not honor that muse when it shows up. And so that's also not part of the thinking that we have when it comes to interest.
And I think that muse shows up when this might not apply to all cases, but in some cases when we start working hard on something, let's say studying hard for an exam the following day or in a few days, or working hard on a job that we are doing for a paycheck. I think the muse is almost as if the muse is watching us work hard and is telling us at that moment, like, if you're working hard on this, what about this other thing that is true to who you are, that is not instrumental, that is just it's a good thing for its own sake for you. It would be an expression of your life. Nobody else can do this. This thing that you're doing instrumentally, anybody can do it. It's just a role. It's a placeholder. You would be fulfilling a placeholder. A functional, you will be like a cog in a machine. But this thing, there's something about it that, it's really hard to talk about what that, for me, it's hard to say what the muse wants from us. But it does want something. And it kind of wants to turn us away from the instrumental activity to something that is for its own sake, that is intrinsically valuable. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting because this question of interest, so you have there's an economic angle to it, how capitalism captures interest, as I was alluding to. There's also a psychological angle. There's a phenomenological, I like phenomenology. Like, what is it like in the experience of when interest changes? How do you feel? What are you observing? Is it happening? You mentioned in the email the environment. How does the environment affect your ability to focus? You mentioned, all of those different things, and it's like there's something. You could have a phenomenology of interest and the experience of changing interest, which I think is really, really fruitful, because I think there's a lot of people today who are dealing with questions of, what do I want to do with my life? A lot of people have a lot of interest. They can't figure out which ones to pursue, which ones not to pursue, what to get a job in, what not to get a job. If you had a phenomenological analysis of the difference between an interest that has this very powerful will behind it and the phenomenological experience of, say, an interest that's just a passing fad, well, that would be a useful guide to help one figure out what has the highest probability of putting in their resources, what they should put their time into. And likewise, if you had a good phenomenological analysis of when losing interest is a sign of that you should lose interest, as opposed to when losing interest is a sign that you need to push harder because you actually need to go deeper in and you'll come out on the other side. Like, what is the difference in those phenomenological experiences? That can be very useful so that you can make a decision about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And I think that's very important. One of the things, as I'll just note quickly, because you were talking about conversation, which I'm always fascinated by this. What's so fascinating to me about a good conversation, and I think this has something to do with a true interest, like that passion interest that we're describing, it has something to do with self-forgetfulness, where you literally almost forget that you're so taken up in the conversation that you're not really thinking about yourself at all. You're thinking about the conversation and the topic and the moving forward of it. And likewise, whenever I was like studying for something or had a paper to write on something I did not care about, the whole time I was thinking, I have a paper to write. I need to get 5,000 words. I have to do this for a grade. But then when the vision showed up of, say, the paper on the Creative Concord, where I had this long paper on Marx, I didn't think about it as writing a paper. I thought about it like as a kind of unfolding of something that needed to manifest, or it came like whole and entire, and then it had to be write out. It's funny, like when you're in that kind of it's like you're not a writer in a sense. It's almost an apophatic tradition, like in Relate Where God Is Not God, kind of Master Eckhart. It's almost like when you're really in that true flow state or whatever, you don't think of yourself as a writer or something, or writing a paper. But when it's a sign that you shouldn't be doing it, then you're thinking of the fact, I'm writing a paper. And a good conversation is likewise one that you don't think of as a good conversation. It just unfolds as itself. And that phenomenological experience seems to be one hint of that kind of self-forgetfulness, seems to be a hint of an interest you should pursue, and an interest that one should surrender or give up is when they're constantly thinking about the fact that they're doing the thing. Like I got to the point where it's like, I am a photographer. That was actually a bad sign. Like thinking I'm doing photography, as opposed to not thinking about doing photography, just taking pictures because you're in the mountains and you saw the sunset and the lights breaking through the clouds, or you would get up at 6 a.m. because the mist with the trees and everything. You weren't like, I'm a photographer, I ought to go take pictures. You woke up, you're like, oh my gosh, you just went. Went. And that seems to be one hint at maybe an angle for it.
Yeah, I agree with your perspective, but I also want to add that the flow state or the self-forgetfulness, although they are really great things, they are wonderful things. They make our lives meaningful and worthwhile, but we don't always do them. We're not always in them.
No.
Sometimes we are out of them, and we can't think of those times that we are out as preparation. Maybe you're preparing. So I think, for example, about myself and other people who went into university, pursued an academic career for a while, and then they lost interest, or they felt let down by the institution or by the people around them. That's how should we think about that? Should we think about that as a mistake, as like you alluded to the metaphor of investment? You invested in the wrong thing, or is there something valuable about going through something and then being disillusioned? And maybe we can think about that process as something preparatory for getting into something deeply and authentically, or in a self-forgetful way. in a way that is, you don't lose interest this time.
Mm.
But maybe we need to go through, like the case of photography in your case, the case of experimental psychology for me, or for other people, it could be, I don't know, classical music. They go through something, they feel like, oh, this is not it. Maybe this is not it for me. And did I waste years of my life? No, I don't think that's the only answer. I don't think it's the best answer. I think it could be, I was preparing. I am still preparing. I am out of that flow state that other people are talking about, but I now have this in my back pocket or in my pocket. I can have this as a reference point. Next time I can detect, like, is this thing repeating again? Am I going through another disillusionment like pattern, or is it something else? Is it something that I can go deeper? Or it could be maybe that flow state is a phase in the activities that we do, that we can't keep that forever, or maybe we shouldn't ask for that to happen all the time. Maybe it is something that we reach on occasion, and we have to be grateful for it, and then say goodbye and wait for the next moment of grace. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's excellent. I think there can be too much of a kind of, oh, the answer is flow states. You hear this a lot.
Right.
Oh, that's the answer. To me, that's the problem. Is like, it's almost like you have people say, oh, you can replace religion with mystical experiences. Yeah, but you got to pay the bills. There's a reason why mysticism never supported entire religious traditions, because you can't be in the mystical experience all the time. And also, some people could confuse a mystical experience as confirming the religion, which actually it should have been evidence that that the mysticism was greater than the religion, right? Because you still have to interpret the mystical experience. Like, maybe you have a flow state when you do. I did wrestling for a number of years. I had some flow states on wrestling. Was that evidence I needed to be a professional wrestler? I decided not, right? But right? So it can be it's one of those things where it should be part of the equation, but it doesn't equal the whole solution. Right. And I think sometimes, in the same way that just saying, like, people who are concerned about the religion question, they'll say, oh, well, I'm spiritual, not religious, as if that answers the problem. It's like, well, no, there's an entire infrastructure. There's a lot more that has to be addressed. So I think you're completely correct on that. I think on this question, I think it's so important. For me, on this notion of, you did something, you're like, oh, I wasted my time. What am I going to do now? If, oh, I dated this person for 30 years and that we're not going to get married. Did I waste my time? Oh, I had this job and I didn't advance. Did I waste my time? I think what's so important, that's where kind of the ability to say it's contingent. Like, if you decide that what happened in the past has nothing to do with what you're going to do moving forward, then yeah, you kind of decided that you wasted your time, right? But you see, your time is always something that you are actively participating in, right? I have decided, basically, or I believe, that photography gave me ways of seeing the world, ways of thinking, ways of approaching, not just ways of being in the world that I use now. Maybe I'm illusioned, maybe I'm deluded, maybe I'm crazy, but I believe that. And I can go through many things like that. I think it's important to choose to think that way, because if instead I were to sit back and say, man, I had a really good photography business for so many years, why didn't I keep going with that? Why didn't I do more? What's going to happen? All I can possibly do is shut myself down, right? And kind of fall over and be done with it. For me, there's a kind of, I want to say, mining memories or mining experience, where you go back and you think through, okay, this happened, and how do I incorporate it into my present moment so that it's helping me see or carry myself in the world in a way that I otherwise would not. Also, I just think, like, having an experience where I have never pursued an interest, gotten to the end of it and found out I didn't want to do it, and that not be extremely helpful. Because I think a lot of people maybe have like 4 or 5 things that they're like, really, really, like, that might be it. You kind of have to exhaust it so that when you're 65 years old, you're not regretting it, right? Like, you don't want to get to 65 and wonder. And for me, that's like if I do photography for a long time, I did a lot, in other fields, or, you get to the end, well, now you get to where you're kind of doing one thing that you're really, really focused on, that you've really kind of made your life plan and work and everything around doing. You can be confident in that thing that you're letting really take your interest is not a dead end and is actually a right direction. And that it becomes easier to put yourself all in it precisely because you had those experiences that helped you narrow down. So for me, those experiences, I'd be curious what you think about it. For me, those experiences helped me increase confidence in what I'm currently doing. Because I went through those and I did my best at them and I exhausted them. And so now if I'm still doing this thing and really believe in what I'm doing with like the OG Rose and all of that, then I have very good reason to be confident in it because I've exhausted all the other things.
Yeah, and maybe they also become layers in your mind, or maybe dimensions that you can go to, positions you can occupy, and like look at this situation through the perspective of a photographer. Because you know, just like the little book for kids, Wrestling is Life. You know, the idea for me is that if you cultivate yourself in a field enough, then you're training yourself to see almost everything else through that lens, through the lens of that metaphor. Wrestling is life. It's not just wrestling is wrestling. But you can take your wrestling hat, put on your wrestling hat when you are working on a philosophical argument. What I think, so I was going to tell you this example. I recently, a couple of months ago, I found a new job. I found a new job in an organization that kind of plays advisory roles to like major players in the capital market scene, like banks, brokers, corporations. And it's an interesting organization. I'm kind of like at a very junior, understandably, I started at the bottom of the organization, but I know people who are in that organization and have been there for, I don't know, 15 years, 20 years. And that's the only place that they have worked. I mean, for them, it's really great and it has its benefits. But when I imagine that life, I realize that I unintentionally lived a life that wouldn't give me that. I mean, I think at some level we do things to create the kind of life that we truly want, even though some of it might be things that on the surface we might complain about. But I really feel like I lived a life to not be that person who has devoted their entire life to this one organization, starting as an intern and then climbing the ladder, and that's their story. And it's when you observe a person like that, the kind of attachment that they have to that organization is almost they almost have a religious affinity. Or pseudo-religious affinities, like they have misidentified. It's like, man, you're not that. You're not just this. You're not only this. There's so much more that you can do. There's so many other emotions you can express. You don't have to like repress everything in the way that you're. Oh, okay, I'm like, now I'm too much into that particular person. But you know, I'm talking about the free play throughout life, a life that we live. So you disengage from something and then you re-engage with something else. And over time, you have these layers. And beyond those layers, you also have this detachment from any particular role. You kind of become a little bit appreciative. I mean, I can say that it enabled me this experience of leaving a job and starting something else several times. It helped me appreciate a sense of freedom. I mean, I really now like an evening that I can just do what I want. That is just such a delight to me, because I can really disengage and detach from all these social roles, all these social expectations, and just be, you know, in this moment. I don't want to say I just be myself. No, just be in this moment. You know, it's because even this identity is another thing to be attached to and be like, be overly, we shouldn't even identify with this sense of self, just like not identifying with an organization.
So there's a few things. So, for me on this question, also a contingency of, leaving something. I've always thought, I'll bring in the word, our beloved Javier Rivera has recently been doing pieces on the philosophy of timing, which we've had some in the net sessions and different things. And, I always like to talk about the phenomenology of the artist, improv, jazz, timing, like skill and different things like that. But he recently on his Substack, and I really enjoyed it, he talked about like timing is time plus action. And we really need to think in terms of timing more than just time in philosophy. And the question, and it kind of crystallizes something I think is very good. For me, a lot of, the problem for me is not so much quitting. It's almost like timing. It's almost like staying at something too long. Like, for example, I worked at a wholesale, it paid the bills, it was blah, blah, blah. But there did come to be a sense where the timing changed. It was now time to go, or it's not time to go deeper into it, right? And now you could look back and say, man, Dan, you wasted 6 or 7 years or whatever at that place. I don't feel that way at all because I left at the right time, right? Not that, because we have to be careful. This is the issue. And this will lead into some Nietzsche that I think is quite good on book 5, The Gay Science, is that it is dangerous to moralize keeping a job forever. It's also dangerous to moralize moving between a bunch of jobs. It's dangerous to moralize the arts. It's also dangerous to moralize practicality. Right. Everything can be overfit, to use that computer science term, right? You can overdo anything. And basically, if we look, one of the ways I've been thinking about Nietzsche lately with Fidel last wonderful philosophy portal conference and different things is I like to say that Nietzsche is deconstructing bestowcentrism, which is any source that bestows upon you your identity or your motivations or whatever. He's deconstructing it. And he basically, a way to look at this is Western philosophy has been a story of someone coming into Plato's cave and dragging you out. And Nietzsche wants to say, we need to think about the prisoner leaving the cave on their own, which is really profound, because how do you even realize you're a prisoner? How do you even realize you're in a cave? And for me, thinking of the Western, I would argue Plato's allegory of the cave is the founding myth of philosophy in the West, basically. And in that story in book 7, someone drags you out. The teacher comes and drags you out, right? So your job comes and gives you an identity. Your position gives you an identity. Now we're going to take you to the truth, right? What would it mean to motivate yourself to leave on your own? Well, how do you even know you need to leave on your own? Stuff becomes a lot more complex. And I really like book 5 of The Gay Science because he stops at book 4 with Zarathustra. He writes, thus spoke Zarathustra, beyond good and evil, and comes back and writes book 5 of The Gay Science. So I think it is a notably unique glimpse into what I think is Nietzsche's overarching project, because I do think there's actually an overarching project. I don't think it's just aphorisms and random collections of thoughts, although the numbers in his books makes it seem that way. He's always going after, he has a section in book 5 where he talks about people who over-identify with their profession. He talks to people who over-identify with their nationality, that over-identify with the arts, where they become actors. It's no longer an aesthetic spirit. And what he basically goes through and shows is that everything has a danger and a potential good. There's a form of the arts that's very good because it's your own creative will coming out. But then there's a form of the arts that is always a mask and an appearance, right? So there's a form of work that's very good because you're believing in something and you're becoming, he talks about the architect building something over centuries. But then there's a form of work where you're over-identifying and you lose yourself in it, right? And he goes on, and I can go on and on and on. Well, if you think about a philosophy of timing, because you can't know what job is going to give you the temptation of over-identifying or not until you do it, right? So in my opinion, you should never regret. If you sit back and you really looked at something and said, I ought to try that, I really believe that might be it, and you do it, you should never regret that. But what you may regret is if it becomes clear to you from something deeper that you need to not do this anymore, that you don't step out. Like timing seems to be a key principle here. Like now that said, when I thought it was time for me not to go any further in my other job, I didn't the next day leave. I spent a month to make sure that it was not just impulse, that it was actually deep. So don't be impulsive, but in my opinion, it becomes pretty obvious when it's not impulse. Like, I think phenomenologically, you can tell the difference between bad day at work and impulsive, as opposed to a deeper, no, this is not right anymore. So for me, this phenomenology of interest, so another part of it, we've talked about self-forgetfulness as a flag. It's not the whole, but it can point to something of the direction of interest. Another component of this seems to be timing. in honor of Javier Rivera's. When you sense that the interest, so the thing that you were doing, it no longer creates spaces of self-forgetfulness, and you can kind of feel that it's time to move on, that can be an indication of a need. So I think in terms of timing, it can be useful here.
I think this applies to human relationships too. Sometimes with a romantic relationship or with a friend, that things, you get an inkling of things not working out. Maybe there's a conflict that doesn't seem to be resolving itself or can't be resolved, and you sometimes, I mean, I had that experience of, I gotta kind of let things fade right now, because I don't want to let things, if I keep insisting on the relationship working or on the friendship working and to live up to this idealistic image, then it might get really bitter.
Right.
But if I just let it go, then it will be a great memory, or it will remain a great part of my life.
Right.
And the same applies to jobs, the same, hobbies, going to the movies, people, again, that example of your friends inviting you to go watch a movie with them. Maybe if you join them that night, you might end up hating, cinema.
That's right.
Going to the cinema. But if you say no, if you keep that distance at that time, if you get the timing right and keep a distance, then you will preserve the joy of going to the cinema, going and watching a movie. So you're kind of keeping things good. You're preserving things by not always engaging with them, by not always.
Just as a quick add, I completely agree. I basically know I'd hate photography. I'm glad I did photography. I don't hate photography at all, but had I not had that timing, I'm very sure I'd hate it. I don't hate my previous job or anything like that, but I'm sure I would hate it if I was still doing it. It's like with fruit. If you don't pull it off the vine at the right time, it rots, right? There's something about, again, timing, it seems a critical component of the conversation, but it's not a category. And I appreciate Javier's work on it, because it's not a category in our thinking. It's like, do until you retire, enjoy, do it out, or you're lazy and you're not seeing it through. That category of timing seems important.
Yeah. So this is actually, it's a little bit complicated, because let's say sometimes you might start a project and the project has its own timing. And your life has its own timing too. So let's say, just as an example that comes to my mind readily, because it's close to off the top of my head, is, let's say, my YouTube channel and the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So my YouTube channel actually it's like a living organism.
Right.
It has its own rhythm. It has its own timing, and it demands to perpetuate according to a certain rhythm. But the rest of my life may not always agree with that. So what do we mean by timing? Is, in that case, it could be one of them sacrificing for the sake of the other one, or it could be a constant negotiation, a constant back and forth. I'm going to give in a little bit here, but I need to kind of get back some energy. I need to kind of be quiet for 2 weeks, regain my energy, and then, okay, I'll give you this. I'll let you have some time later. YouTube persona. So this sometimes my point there was there might be sometimes a conversation between two or more parts that have different time courses, and we're going to figure out and make a decision, which timing am I going to be more faithful to, and which one I might want to sacrifice.
I think you're getting into extremely important topic, especially in today's world, where there's a creator economy, there's all these different possibilities, and you see this radical creator exhaustion. Almost, it's a kind of like exhaustion of creators. It's almost new. I don't know if I want to say that, but there's some kind of unique exhaustion that you see forming in creator communities. I think that needs to one needs to put their finger on that, because people may be doing indeed the thing that they're interested in and that they love, but there can still be an exhaustion that can emerge even when you're doing what you're supposed to do, because of that constant negotiation that becomes exhausting in figuring it out. I think this is a very important topic. So for me on that, I always think about, I guess, think in terms, just on my own life, on how can I structure this so that it stays alive? And
Mm.
what that means, so for example, like once the other job I had was going to get to the place where it would require too much time, then I myself couldn't stay alive. I couldn't be there for the family. I couldn't do all the other things, right? But then also with my own YouTube channel, I think about it in terms of what can I do to keep it alive to where I don't feel like it's killing me? And that's where I do. So for me personally, I'm not saying this is what other people should do. So I do a lot of like still shot summaries of papers I've done, right? Because I wrote those papers, but I can do that and I can do it consistently. Because that's the other question. What can I do consistently that doesn't exhaust me, but also keeps it alive, right? And I think in terms of, I'm sure, for example, that I don't think in terms of metrics. Maybe I should think in terms of metrics. I don't know. But I personally don't, because what I would have to do for the metrics could be very exhausting and I couldn't keep it alive. And it's more important to me to keep it alive, even if that's just summaries of papers that people don't, it's like, well, why should we care about a paper that you wrote as opposed to say a famous paper by Thomas Nagel or something like that, right? Well, because this is the way I can do it to stay alive. This is how I can do it and it not feel like it's going to kill me, right? Because I also have to, work at the venue, make the money, pay for the bills there. But this way I can do it to where I can keep it alive. And so for me, what's been very helpful is an adjustment of the metric from growth to consistency and doing work that I believe in. Like every Friday, we try to do an OG Rose conversation. That's why we're doing this. Well, that for me is a doable task. That's something I can do consistently. And also I'm having conversations with people like you that I want to speak with about topics that I find fascinating and life-giving. So then that can help me abate this exhaustion. And also the main goal for us, like Michelle and I, is actually finishing the books and the writing of the books, right? So that always, you also keep, and like you said, there's a timing for that, where you say, oh, Belonging Again has been edited and worked on since 2016, but it's not time yet. It's almost there. It's coming together. It's finished. It's just not edited. So you don't force it. So the question you're getting at too, it's like the ability to identify. So we've talked about identifying kind of self-forgetfulness, timing, but there's something also here about how do I structure things so that I don't fall into this creative exhaustion? And that seems to be the correct metric, as opposed to, oh, do I have X amount of growth? Do I have X number of time? Because not that I'm saying growth is bad. I am not saying that a growth strategy is bad in any way whatsoever. But the key is that whatever growth strategy you have, it must be one that does not generate creative exhaustion. And that might be slower. Maybe that's good. Maybe you just happen to love creating content that people like. Well, God bless you, by all means. But this is another topic of figuring out very tangibly what you have to do to not suffer that exhaustion. Like, and then I'll just add, like for me, I could never have a pay. I don't know if I could ever do a job that made money that was also like using my brain, and also do the OG Rose writing. Like, I just know me that I would get home and be dead, right? So I do blue collar stuff. That was for me personally a way to find that negotiation and not suffer into exhaustion or hopelessness because you don't have enough time and you always feel exhausted. So I really love this topic you brought up. I think it is so important to think about that in the creator economy.
Yeah, yeah. It is really strange. Some of the, we see signs of it that people don't necessarily notice when they do. For example, imagine you might be following somebody on YouTube and they don't post anything, and maybe after a month of silence they post something and they begin the video by saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I haven't posted anything. Like, why are you apologizing? Like, it's fine. Like, you don't, but it implies that there's a debt to this thing that it has now grown. But just that expectation existing itself is a good sign. The fact that the thing that you created demands something from you, it means like an organism, it has reached enough growth that is a thing in its own right. It is like an organism that it can demand to be fed, to take things, and continue to survive. So that itself is a good sign, but we can also interpret that as an alarm, because it's a kind of life that wants to go on living at the expense of other things that are actually alive, and those things need to be protected, because it is structured in a way with technology, with all those metrics, that really wants to go full force in a heavy way, in a very brute way, that is not considerate of the life around it, and a life that is feeding it, that is supporting it. Yeah.
No, I think that's so important. This kind of contingency of that feeling of debt, where in one way it can be good because it empowers you to create, but in another way it can be inconsiderate of all the other factors that want to consider it. Again, something I was going to say on Nietzsche again is when he talks about beyond good and evil, it sounds like he's like trying to move beyond morality in some sort of anti-morality state. What he's warning about and concerned about is how when you do a job, there's been an ethic to keep that job until you die, even if you're miserable, right? There's an ethic, for example, to not pursue your own interests because that's selfish, right? And so he goes through in book 5 and identifies all these ways that ethics can be used to destroy people, to keep people from their will, capital W will, manifesting in their own internal drives. And he says a very important part in Beyond Good and Evil, one of the parts, he says something like, love is always beyond good and evil. So he critically defines love as not reducible to moral categories. So when he's talking about going beyond good and evil, he's talking about going to like value, love, almost something higher than good and evil. Also critically, he warns that what we tend to define as good is just not evil. So it doesn't have enough substance in of itself. That's the problem with good and evil. It's like it tells you what not to do, but it doesn't tell you what to do. And if you try to do something for yourself, it then contains you. So that's why Nietzsche, so when he places love as beyond good and evil, that's kind of tied to interest, right? Love, interested in someone. That's why the topic of romance comes together, and your love is driving you in a certain direction. And so a lot of times that debt, like if you yourself have a drive to create, it can be good to feel that debt because it's like, I should be honoring this thing I love, right? And that's a good thing. But the Nietzsche move would say there's another form of that then turns it into a burden that has your love exhaust itself into effacement. And that's what you have to be careful of. So this is then where you think about that, right? Where you're aware of what are the negotiations, what are the trade, what are the expectations that I'm creating that I can actually manage to honor, right? And to maintain, so that debt feels like a motivation as opposed to a burden. Because debt can be if I'm $1,000 in debt, that might be because that $1,000 is going to turn into 10,000 because I've invested it, right? Or debt can be a burden because it's carrying you down. But that right there is then the question of how to structure in a very practical sense one's time, and then being phenomenologically aware of your own exhaustion. So I liked what you were saying.
Yeah, great. So I want to share with you that a memory, a very unforgettable memory I had as a kid. I was a teenager, not a kid, but I was at a social gathering, and there was a musician there. There was a person who was performing some music, and there were actually 3 brothers. So one of the brothers was a musician, a very impressive musician. Another one was showing people some paintings that he had done. So there was a 3rd brother there. And I kind of naively, I went to the 3rd brother, who was actually very charismatic. He had more gravitas than the other 2 artists. And I just naively asked him, so what do you do? Do you also paint, or do you like music? And he took a step back and said, no, I just walk and breathe. And I was very confused by that, but that's an episode from my life that I will never forget. And I learned a lot from that one moment, from that one response, because there has been a lot of times in my life that I feel confused. I feel I feel under pressure from my own expectations or expectations of other people. I feel like I should be doing something else or something more intensively. But then I go back to that baseline and I say, just walk and breathe. For other people, it might not apply to everybody. Some people might not be able to walk, but sit and breathe. Live and breathe. That is the baseline, and that's enough. To to regard that, and here's my understanding of Nietzsche, to regard anything else necessary as long as you're alive as necessary for being would be nihilism. Just walking and breathing, just be and breathe, live and breathe. And that's your baseline. Anything else is a bonus. You know, sometimes we can empathize with this. It's not always easy, but when we can, when that's enough, then we are not nihilistic. We are truly not nihilistic. We are truly in a position to celebrate just bare life. And that's great.
I think that's a very good way to put Nietzsche, because the thing that he's identifying is that there's something about man as almost like Plato's cave that has a tendency to be unable to just walk and breathe. Like we create status anxiety, we create occupation, we create all these different things. Like what, you know, a way I put it is overman means the man is Plato's cave. The overman is the one who leaves Plato's cave, the one who overcomes man. It's not this like Superman, Nietzsche, super strong person. Like overman is the one who overcomes man. And man is this tendency to be unable to appreciate walking and breathing. It's this need to be socially approved of, this need to have, you know, to fall into these different ethics and to be approved of. What's so funny is a lot of the people Nietzsche critiques would be ones who you would think would be overmen because they've been successful and they've risen to the top of the hierarchy. He's like, no, they're actually still within man, the cave. They haven't overcome those needs for that status, you know, for that status and different things like that. That's such a lovely example that you made, because one of the reasons why I always do appreciate photography and don't regret it in any way whatsoever is because one, it gave me a reason to keep going into the woods and to keep hiking and to really go, oh my goodness, the world is beautiful. Oh my goodness, there's always something to explore just behind your house. Oh my goodness, there's always something to see where you don't need to go off and do something flashy. You don't need to go off. Just being able to take a walk is an extraordinary undertaking. And that it's very interesting you say that, because for me, like I was talking, that's always been the baseline. It's funny you mentioned, because it's like, if you can do that, it's all good. You know, it's all good. There's nothing wrong with having a YouTube channel. There's nothing wrong with having a job or different things like that. But it helps you, for me, kind of the experience is, and like when it feels like it's taking away from my ability to breathe or to take walks or to sit on the porch, then I know it's out of order, that it's disordered and that something needs to change. And so my metric has kind of been to design it. What job can I have that pays for the bills? What rate of creativity, what kind of writing can I do to maintain that space, that ability to breathe? And it's not always perfect, of course, but at least knowing that's the goal has always been important for me. And I think also I always was taken, you know, it kind of goes in line, you know, St. Augustine says that evil is a disordered good, that nothing that exists is evil, it's always disorder. So the name of the game is avoiding disorder. It's not always easy how to do that, because what's your baseline? And I think, like you're saying, that baseline really goes a long way to helping you order things in a manner that you don't have that exhaustion.
Yeah. The funny thing about breathing is that we all do it as long as we're alive, but we're not always in a position, or we don't always allow ourselves to be in a position to celebrate that and be content with it. Like, yeah, well, how great is it that I'm breathing now? You know, I used to have like, I have mixed feelings about saying this, because I don't feel bad about it. It's just a part of my life. I used to have chronic pain for about 5-6 years. It's not a big deal now, but it really was one of those experiences that allowed me to celebrate. Just sheer being, sheer like being, breathing, pain-free. It's amazing. It is amazing. And to go from that to go, that could be our home base, to leave that and go do stuff. You know, that would be great too, to pursue creative projects. But if those projects don't work out, so what? You know, you still have that home base, have that baseline, hopefully.
Well, and for me, when you have that baseline, then this question of what interests should you pursue, when should you change interests, you now have a kind of standard. Like, for example, if you get to something where you're going to work and it becomes more difficult to come home and have that baseline because you're stressed out, or you're depressed or you exalt, well, then you can go, oh, these are all phenomenological evidence that the time is I need to leave, that you can switch your timing. But if it's something that you do that after you do it, you're actually even more able to breathe and enjoy things. And you feel like it actually enhances that experience. Like, for example, reading books, philosophy, conversations like this always feels like it enhances my ability to just walk and breathe, right? Well, that's a sign that one should do it. And that's also a better sign. We were talking about how the flow state can be overfit as a sign. For me, that ability of feeling like, to go back to the baseline of appreciating life more, to feeling like life is more alive. I don't think that's the same as the flow state. And to me, that might be the metric, the most important sort of sign. It's like, oh, this is something you ought to do. Now, if it gets to the point where, because it does seem like when we're talking about the creative economy, there's a kind of curse to growth. Like, it gets to the point where then there's so much more to manage, so many different things. It can be a problem when it gets to that point. At the same time, it's not bad to pursue. It's always about the how. But if you can always at least ask the question, okay, is this getting to the place where my baseline is disrupted? Is this removing from me the ability for, I always like how at the end of Chronicles of Narnia, it's like blue is more like blue, sunsets are more like sunsets, people are more like people. Like, that's, resurrection is not leaving the earth, but the earth becoming more like its full self, where colors are more colorful and things like that. That's always been, to me, a very good description of whatever you're interested in should do that. If it does not do that, you should shift it. You should not do it. Now, I can't say that unfolding chairs at the venue necessarily makes blue more like blue or different things like that. But here's the thing. Since it creates the space to do the things that enhance that baseline, it actually gets folded into the story of which makes all those things possible. So even though I would not on my own choose to do that thing, since I know I have to pay for the bills, have to take care of the family or different things, it actually becomes part of the story. It's very interesting. It feels like it's part of the story, and it's part of almost the conflict part of the story that makes it a good story. So another thing that this does is make things even that you don't want to do, it gets kind of sublated and folded into a story feeling that makes it then you're good to do them, because it doesn't get in the way of the other things, and in fact is necessary to pay the bills to do those things. So that's another phenomenological experience. Does it feel like it's part of the story? Does it feel like it contributes to a story? That's always been helpful for me too.
Yeah. I think I understand your point. Being part of a story means not interfering with the rest of the story.
Yes.
And the folding of chairs, the kind of jobs that we are choosing to do, they don't interfere with that baseline with our home base.
Yes.
And this actually, it's not very common to do this. And in fact, I'm willing to bet that most people would regard us as weird and strange, because at least at my workplace, I know that if my boss pushes me to a point where, sometimes bosses do that, employers say, you do this, or, you're going to perform at this level, extreme level of productivity, or you're fired. Well, I'm in a position to say, well, that's okay, I'm fired, I guess. And that's really, it's almost scary from the perspective of people who are attached to that job, who forget that this is not the only thing that they can do. They can do lots of other things. You don't have to completely sacrifice your well-being to be in this specific employment.
No.
But yeah, holding on to that baseline and choosing to do things in a way, or the kinds of things, or in a style that doesn't interfere with just walking and breathing, that is key.
Yes.
But I wish more people were mindful of that, because then we would have been living in a different society, I think.
Oh, well, the thing to say, and I know as we come up on the close here, I could speak to you for hours and hours and hours, because I always appreciate you so much, and you always bring in the right question. I'm always impressed. You always do such a wonderful job of bringing in the angle that's just so fitting for the topic. So I appreciate that about
Likewise.
you.
Likewise.
Well, you're a gentleman. And one of the things, like that notion of, oh, I'll get fired, is like the anxiety and the fear, right? Like that's one of the things. So we've kind of been in this conversation pointing as to me little markers of what are phenomenologically experienced. Important things to note that are signs that maybe something need to change or that you're doing something wrong or so on and so forth. The presence of fear tends to be a very strong indicator that you should not be doing this or that you need to change. Now, one needs to make a distinction between you look out your window and there's a lion in the yard and you don't go outside because you don't want to get eaten. That's not really fear. That's almost like wisdom, right? It's just kind of stupid to go in a yard if there's a lion, right? Likewise, it would be stupid to like scream at a customer at your work because, they'll get mad and your job will fire you, right? That's just kind of stupid. But once you make the distinction between wisdom and fear, where fear in this context is more like a kind of anxiety, where you say, oh my gosh, what will happen if I lose this job? What will I do on and so forth and so on? Now, there is something to be said of, if you've got bills to pay and you've got a credit card debt and different things like that, that you don't want to be careless. There's a difference between that. But there should be, if you're saying, I'm only doing this job because I'm afraid, then, afraid of what will happen if I don't do it. Well, then you might want to put in order, if you have a lot of credit card debt or something, a 6-month plan to where you get to the place where you're not in that hole, or where you can, and while you're doing that, be developing a skill on the side and be planning to move. So for example, when I was at my other job, I was also working at this venue because I've always wanted to have multiple jobs precisely so that if stuff didn't go right or there was a problem, I had something to fall back on. And I've also in my free time done writing and like you have different cards. So you want to have that because when you have options, it's easier to maintain a baseline because your boss doesn't have too much leverage against you. But that all aside, you should do all of that. If you make this distinction between anxiety and wisdom, if you're anxious, that actually might be a really good sign that you need to just lean on into that anxiety and drop the job and find out, actually, you are someone who can rise to the occasion. Turns out that you're very intuitive and you have a lot of ingenuity when stuff hits the fan and you need to figure it out. These things can happen. The other thing I'll say to that as just a side note, there are so many college educated people that are very competent that feel that way. That's like, oh my gosh, what will happen? There is always a factory looking for a worker, a plumber that is in need, a painter that is in need. You know how much money you can make painting? It's unbelievable. Like blue collar jobs, different things like that. And I'm not saying that people should go do those things. What I'm saying is that it's in your head that it's the apocalypse because of how your boss focuses things to where it's this or nothing, right? That's not reality. You may not want to be a plumber. You may not want to paint. I'm not saying you should. But if it truly, truly, truly was the apocalypse, like if it truly was, everything's hitting the fan and you're doomed, then you could do that. You could do that, right? And so for me, thinking that has actually always been important because then I can't get into that narrow hole stuck because I know push comes to shove, I can just unload trucks, right? So you always have a bit of freedom. And I think that freedom is important so that you can follow, so you can keep that baseline alive. So, that's always been something important for me.
Perfect. So that what we are talking about is not just ways of thinking that are better. We are talking about ways of living and ways of living, not only as individuals, but ways of living as individuals that are moving, that could be moving us towards better communities in which those employers could not control people using fear and anxiety and so forth. So that's a better community, better society where people are not controlled with those negative emotions. So it's but it all fits together. Having a baseline, not getting too attached, getting attached in the right way, and being moved by inspiration and interest. And being true to those indicators.
I think it all goes together. For me, the topic is so interesting, and I'm so glad you brought it up because it fits into all of those perspectives. Like the whole idea that you shouldn't pursue an interest is tied to the question of does it pay or not, which is a job question, which is paid to do other people understand it or not, which then what's your metric, status or being able to take walks in the woods? Like the question of how you live relating to your interests affects every area of your life.
Mhm.
And so it is very important to structure your life around those interests, and in a manner, of course, that has the people around you who you care most about participating in with it, right? And so they're part of it, but you're also part of their harmony. The other term I mentioned, story, like it all folds into the same story. Well, likewise, that's kind of the harmony you mentioned. It all folds into the same harmony. You know, do you go to the movies or not? Does it maintain the harmony? Another reason I'll say that that baseline, this story, the structure we're describing is so important is because actually without it, it's pretty hard to make decisions. Like with this structure, you have like a rubric for decision making. You can look at an opportunity and versus just kind of a vague sense of, oh, is it a good opportunity? Maybe I should go to the movie. It might be a good movie. Like there's a lot of indecisiveness you can have, and indecisiveness can create anxiety, right? It can make unhappiness, and you can just kind of feel lost, like you don't know what you're doing. Having this kind of sense of structure, I have found, is also very helpful for making decisions. And that is actually helpful for your thinking, because as opposed to having your thinking go off into all these possibilities of maybe you should do this or maybe you shouldn't, your thinking becomes more focused on what maintains the story, what doesn't maintain the story, who are the people that are part of the story, and who are the people of whom I can help their story with the way that I'm doing things. And you think about your family in those structures, and you think about your children in those structures. What are their stories, and how do you maintain the harmony of their stories, and how do you figure? So then you also get a standard between self, like when to do things like this, when to kind of make openings for doing different things because your friends want to do other things. Like you have standards of decision making that you can entertain. With that, without this structure, it's all random. It's very anxiety producing. So that's another reason why I think it's important to follow this thread, because it creates a structure of operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. We got it. We nailed it.
I tell you what, all in a good night's work, my friend, in a good night's work. Well, Davood Gozli, I always appreciate speaking with you. You're a
Thank
gentleman.
you so much.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for this delightful topic. And again, I just think it's just a magnificent subject. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your work. I always learn so much from you. I always get excited when I see that you've put forth something, that you've created a new video, a new work, a new insight. And I salute the reading groups you've been doing on Kant. That is amazing, my friend, that you've been going through the whole canon of Immanuel Kant. So that is an amazing accomplishment.
Thank you. Yeah, it's we almost ran out of gas, but we made it. We have 2 more sessions to go. The only part that is left to discuss is religion within the bounds of reason. But Kant is amazingly, like, maybe you should talk about this at some other time. But he is amazingly contemporary to us. He has, to me, he offers all the resources necessary for a good critique of philosophy as well as philosophizing and doing it within appropriate limits. But of course, when you're reading any great philosopher, Nietzsche, Kant, but you always have this sense that they're enough, but of course they are not. But while you're reading them, it seems like they're offering sufficient resources. But yeah, it's been good.
Well, I salute you. And something that has fascinated me is this magic of rereading. Like going back and because I wasn't going to read, I had no plan to read Nietzsche again, but then Cadell was like, oh, well, this looks great. And the Dust books all through, started writing these other things. And going back and being like, how did I miss this? How did I not see this? How did I not know that was there? And it's this kind of like, oh my goodness, this is very different from what I thought. And in a way that is not, that's like, this helps me live better. Like, wow, there's stuff here that helps me get, it really speaks to the magic of rereading, not merely reading another book, but rereading. There's something about rereading that has this magical experience where you're like, wow, where it all comes out. I have not dived hard. I went through a phase like, Dr. Sadler, the great Mr. Sadler, he always talks about the Wittgenstein phase, the Derrida phase, the Sartre. I had a similar thing where about 10 years ago, I went through all of Kant, but that was 10 years ago. And I had a phase 11 years ago of all of Nietzsche, Sartre, and different things. And it's always amazing to go and reread them and be like, oh my gosh, I It changes. You get older and things change. But before I keep you for another hour on that, I just want to thank you again, Davood Gozli. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about thought.
Yes. I look forward to that very much, Davood. Thank you for doing that. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Looking forward to it. Bye.